Hello and welcome back to another Archaeo-Scope. This series is kind of like an inverted questions of doom, where rather than you sending me a question to try and answer to the best of my ability, I put a question out there for you in the shape of a video to go away and think about, to comment below, discuss and debate, and hopefully together come up with an idea that one of us on our own might not have had, a sort of a meta response to the question of the day. And today's question is inspired actually by a daily, frustration on my part. Most mornings I drive Mrs. Soup to work, and most mornings we have to deal with the sort of the lumps and bumps of the road until we get to the motorway. Basically, potholes. And this is a problem which is more and more common across the world, not least because of problems with budgets. Ever since the credit crunch, municipalities and governments and local authorities have had problems with keeping infrastructure in tip-top condition. And actually a couple of years ago, famously, infamously I suppose, the authority in charge of the Lake District, Cumbria, in the northwest of England, said that all they could do was manage the decline of the roads. They couldn't actually keep them repaired. They could simply manage the disrepair of that system, that road system. And I don't know about you, but when I think about roads and archaeology, the first thing I think about is Romans. They're famous as road builders, famous for those straight roads, but also in that sense famous, seemingly, in reconstructions for having pristine roads, a pristine road network. The drawings are always of lovely, beautifully straight, lovely paved roads with a beautiful camber where the rainwater can run off to each side into drainage ditches. There'll be a cohort of soldiers marching along with maybe a horse and cart going to market or something like that. And that's kind of how we imagine, how we reconstruct the Romans, I think, all too often. And in fact, anyone who builds anything, the Aztec and the Maya, for example, we don't really think about them in a state of decline unless we're asking the question about, for example, civilization collapse. So people will say, how did the Maya civilization come to an end? And then they think about the ruins in a jungle sort of context. But when we think about living spaces, we tend to think and imagine them as being somehow pristine and brand new. And I find that really interesting, in so much as the reality, certainly the reality that I'm living in, is one of actually consistent obsolescence. Technically speaking, the road system that we have certainly is not up to scratch in terms of the road surface, but also actually in terms of capacity. I don't know about you, but certainly in the city where we live, the rush hour is anything but. It's a slow hour. People cannot get into work as quickly as they might want to, or get in, wherever they get to school or whatever, because the road network is in fact insufficient for the capacity of traffic. And yet, in the future, historians and people who draw reconstructions will draw pristine motorways. They'll draw traffic going up and down. They may even draw and reference technology that we kind of only really are accessing on the fringes, in so much as, for example, electric-powered cars and super-fast trains and this kind of thing. It's a technology that's possible right now, but the reality is more decrepit, more rusty, more frustrating than perhaps a future historian will portray. And I find that fascinating. And I suppose I'm curious as to whether or not there is a problem in that sense, whether or not actually, in general, when it comes to how we conceive of history, we tend to conceive of history not only in a sort of a cartoonish kind of way, which has always frustrated me, this sort of succession of periods, the Romans and the Saxons and the Vikings and the Tudors, and it's kind of, then the Plantagenets or whatever, then the Tudors. That's sort of an unrealistic idea that somehow one day people are suddenly, we are now Roman. But in that sense as well, what the reality of being now Roman means. The fact that actually that day-to-day use of Roman roads might have been just as frustrating as day-to-day use of our roads. And in fact you can see that often on the roads leading into Roman cities, and also, for example, in Greece and parts of Turkey. you can, well, Anatolia, you can sort of see where trackways have built up, where just years, hundreds of years of traffic of horses and carts have just eroded these pathways into the stone. You can sort of see actually that the roads weren't pristine, and therefore the buildings wouldn't have been pristine, and therefore the smells would have been much more pungent, and therefore the problems would have been much more vibrant and real. See what I mean? I sometimes wonder whether or not we're missing a texture in our comprehension of the past, a texture which actually we have to deal with every single day. Now, while we think about that, it's also worthwhile, I suppose, reflecting on the idea that we sort of construct our reality as we go anyway. It's a slightly cliched thing to say, but yes, reality exists, as it were, in each of our heads. And in that sense as well, we all sort of carry with us an idea of what the world is, an idea of what a tree is, an idea of what a road is, an idea of what a house is. In particular, in our culture, certainly in Britain and in much of the Western world, one of the first things that children draw will be this square house with square windows and a triangular roof. We carry with us an unblemished and uneroded idea of what's outside, which I think is possibly part of the source of this frustration for some people. This idea of well, the road isn't as it should be. You see what I mean? As opposed to, well, that's a road and it's in use and it is in a poor state of repair. People get frustrated because actually the road as a concept has been somehow compromised in being real, or by being real, and is therefore subject to frustrating elements such as erosion, weathering, and use. Maybe that's what it is, and maybe actually, in that sense, it's something that we can't really escape. Is an idealized concept of what our world is, what things should be like, and therefore also when we think about the past, and possibly when we think about the past with a less than total scope of knowledge, which inevitably we're going to be. We can't know everything that happened in the past. We fall back on an idealized concept of, beautifully paved Roman roads, or wonderfully finished and organized Mayan temple complexes and areas where people gathered and played, the ball game in those ball courts, this kind of thing. And so perhaps this isn't really a problem. Perhaps actually this is simply part of the human condition, and inevitably we're going to be imagining all periods of history, including the time that we live in, as perhaps the best that it could be. Maybe that's a way of looking at it. We imagine it as pristine and shiny because that's kind of how it was conceived, and how we would want people to be able to use it, and also to remember it in the future. Perhaps this is simply a byproduct of having a consciousness and being subject to the rules of physics, decay and thermodynamics and all that kind of thing. We're always going to be playing catch up with the reality of existing. Now, you may be thinking, we're not philosophers. And you're right. We are straying into a sort of a realm of existential crisis, really there. But I think it's still relevant in so much as it definitely impacts on how we think about the past, and also how we think about the day-to-day reality of artifacts that are recovered in archaeology. So I think there is something quite meaty there to talk about and to latch on to. So please do comment below, and let's try and hash this out. What are these issues and problems? Where does that friction come from? And should we be trying to be aware of it when we do reconstruct the past? Should we try and imagine a sort of a slightly dirty, for example, Rome? Which actually some people have done. I mean, the Rome TV series was excellent for doing that, for trying to sort of get beyond the pristine marble. And I think so that there are people out there, and there are people who achieve that. But it's all about how we do this in our day-to-day reckoning of history, which interests me. Yeah. Anyway, have a think. Do comment below, and let's see what comes out of this. As ever, guys, until next time, do take care. Bye bye. Just in case they blow off.
You're all right.
Yes.
Come on.